So my name is Koen Poppe. I work for Vandewiele company. This is a Belgian company, and I will talk about embedding documentation into our QML application. The title might be a bit confusing, so first of all, a slight disclaimer. Embedded means that the documentation is part of the software. It's not running on an embedded system or something. And documentation is like a manual, so it's intended for end users which use our controllers to actually produce things. So this is a slight overview. If we could perhaps scale this a bit. No problem. So I'll maybe already continue. On top there would be Vandewiele Group, which is started in about 140 years ago as a family company in Belgium. Since then it has grown quite significantly, and now we have offices in a lot of countries in Europe and even in Asia as well. What is our business? You might not be familiar with our company. We actually make textile machines. So even though you don't know the company, you might know the product. Actually, the seats you're sitting on, this is velvet. There's a high chance this is produced on one of our machines. You can also find us in carpets, in specific fabrics for clothing, and also in technical textiles, like, for example, sneakers or airbags and this kind of specific textiles applications. So to give you an idea of how our machines look like, this is an assortment of our latest machines. On the left, you have an extrusion machine which creates yarn from plastic granulates. Then there's conditioning of these yarns. There's weaving machines, tufting machines. Well, the main thing to remember is that these are quite big machines and they have lots of options. So even though we sell a weaving machine, you can choose the width, you can choose attachments. We almost ship as many variants of our products as we ship machines themselves. So there's a lot of customizations, and most machines are completely built to order. Of course, as I'm part of the group that creates the user interfaces for these machines, we also have to make our software very adaptive. And so next to C++ backend, we have a touch-based UI, which is written in QML and Qt Quick 2 controls, as with the previous speaker, and it is fully adaptive. So since we redesigned this interface about 6-7 years ago, we really tried to minimize the cognitive load, as we learned yesterday, and remove as much text as possible and show only the relevant things, by either using icons or just simply hiding things that aren't relevant for at that point of time or for that specific machine. So the software really adapts, and if you install the same package on one machine and another machine, it might look quite different because of the available options. So with writing software, there's also the point of making manuals. And well, this is something we can't avoid because there are regulations that dictate that you ship a machine with a manual, which is also translated into the language of the operators that are going to use it. So it's quite a big task to keep this documentation up to date and ensure that all possible options from which the customer can choose are actually present and documented in this manual. So that way, it's also quite easy if the software has a new release that some of the screenshots are slightly outdated and some of the information might be missing. We put a lot of effort into keeping those up to date, but it's quite a challenging task. And this is quite a contrast to what end users are actually expecting. Especially us as developers, we are used to having very good documentation from Qt, and having the ability to provide detailed and accurate and up-to-date information to our customers is something we have somehow come to expect. Also, we noticed that when we ship a new update or install a new update, one of the most common questions is, well, what does this button do? What can you do with this feature? So these are situations where the users don't want to grab the manual and start reading. You can't just say read a fairly substantial manual because, well, it would take too long and it's inconvenient and would break up their usual workflow. So we started thinking about integrating some of the help into the application itself. And I'm certainly not going to claim that this is a new idea. For example, Visual Basic in 1989 already had this concept. You could assign a certain ID to a control, and then if you press the question mark on top, you could select another object in the UI and see some brief help about it. So this is only possible because there's support from the Visual Basic runtime, and it's limited to the application itself. So with this in mind, we set out to try to replicate something similar into QML. Obviously, there is a tooltip control which you can use, but this is mostly for a mouse-centric UI. It's not really suited for a touch-based UI, which is present at our machines. So we set out to do this. I actually was on a train and had 5 hours in front of me, and I started working on this. And strangely enough, or luckily, after these 5 hours, I already had a working prototype. So there are two concepts in QML that really sped this up, made this really easy. And the first is the concept of attached properties. You probably all are aware with having the specific fill width or fill height properties you can assign when working in a layout that has, well, is a layout and is not just an anchor-based UI. Also, component uncompleted seems to be one of the attached properties that is used quite frequently. And so this feature allows us to add new properties to any QML component. And, well, we could add properties this way, which is really nice. Furthermore, QML allows for inspection. So as you write your QML, you get an entire tree with subcomponents and so on. So at runtime, you can actually go through this entire tree and check which elements have this attached documentation property. That way you can, well, make an inventory of all the elements in the scene that are actually have documentation. For those working on QML UIs, I certainly recommend the Gamma Ray tool, which KDAP has developed. This also has a view, quick scenes it's called, and there you also have a at runtime view of this entire view hierarchy. So by going through this and looking for all the items that are documented, we can actually move on. So how does this look in code? Well, we set out to minimize the impact of adding documentation. So if we look at this specific section here in QML, it might look something like this. So if we want to add some information about what these two angles actually represent, we just add VDV documentation, which is actually the name of the attached property, and then we assign an ID and a brief text. Then this brief text is something we would like to show as a help text at the application itself while it's running. So you see, these are just 2 lines. Let's see if this is sufficient to guide the user while he's using our application. So a small demo. We have here another screen. And on the top left, there's a button indicating where the user is currently, where he is in our software. And if we press this button, we create an overlay, which shows that all other functions are now temporarily disabled, and you see rectangles at the points where we have found documentation, where we have attributed these elements with help text. Notice, for example, as well, that here we have attributed a text to a set of controls. It doesn't have to be specific to one button or one slider or one text field. We have it for groups of controls. In my opinion, this makes much more sense than starting to document every individual item, because the UI is built in blocks, and it makes sense to actually document them that way. So once you're in the documentation mode, you can select one of those rectangles, one of those groups of controls, and then when clicking on this, the brief text which we added in code as brief attribute is shown. Notice that nowhere in the code we had to specify where this rectangle should be drawn, because, well, while traversing this view hierarchy, you know the bounds, you know the positions, the X, Y, the width, height. So it's actually a single line to transform that into the coordinate system of the overlay and show the rectangle on its correct position. So moving on, selecting another indicator rectangle shows you the help text of that. And, well, clicking anywhere or tapping anywhere else goes back to normal operations. We've shown this to some of our operators at the factory, and they really started using it in every screen. So whenever they were unsure about a certain button, they started pressing the top left icon to get to this help, just to reassure that they have the right button, that they are changing the right parameter. And this really gives them confidence when using our software. So this has a lot of benefits. As we learned just before lunch, it's important to not delay the documentation of the UI too much. So in my opinion, it makes sense to do this together with the development of the UI itself. So while working on this QML, we immediately add this documentation property, and then this is one thing that can be committed and shipped. It's compatible with the translation workflow, meaning that if we have translated other text, this text will also be shown in the relevant language of the operator. Furthermore, because it's part of the code, it's always in sync. So you never have outdated documentation of this kind. It also gets reviewed. So if someone adds new controls and hasn't added the documentation for it, it will get refused and will require some more work. So it's documentation for end users, and also for some of the developers that might not be that familiar with the software, it's easy to get an idea of what's going on. Furthermore, it is surprisingly lightweight. So most of the QML code is related to showing this popover element, and most of the C++ is related to making the list of documented components available in QML. So that's some code which presents this as an abstract list model. So that's really nice, but then once you have this, you start to wonder, how can we move along? And actually, you can automate a lot more. There are functions in QML to take a screenshot of a certain item. So if you combine this with this lookup of the documentation and this brief help, you can actually do this for your entire application. You can just script this and make it click around, take a screenshot, take the documented items. This way you can end up with a list of screenshots and the associated documentation. Notice also that if you do this on a machine, because the UI is completely adaptive to all the features that are present at this machine, you will get a list of screenshots that is completely tailored to this specific set of options and features. This is quite nice because previously we only had documentation for one family, which had way too many things. And now we can provide a list of screenshots which is just for that machine and specific for that one only. Furthermore, it's quite trivial to chain this list of screenshots and provide it in some kind of interactive web page where you can also search for this brief text and only show, for example, here all the UI items that are related to tensions in this context. And of course, you can present or provide this to your end users in some kind of web platform. And as we learned yesterday, every web page is just one URL away. You can actually just take tap and hold on these popover elements, and you get a QR code which will redirect you to this page and has all the information. Furthermore, this is some kind of different view on your software. Instead of having lots of screens, you have screenshots with associated documentation items. And this is actually a tree with your screenshots and the documented items, and you could start adding notes to them. For example, operators, instead of writing down things in the manual, they could actually say, okay, on this documented item, I want to have a note with some specific setting for a specific textile product or anything. And they could this way keep track of all their notes in one location. Also for technicians, there might be ways to share movies, instructions, and so on, so that they know if they have to install a certain option, that they need to configure things some way or another. Also, customers could add remarks that are specific to the company, and we could, our cloud platform could make sure that this is only visible for those customers, of course. And well, because we can automate taking screenshots and providing already this ID-based skeleton of our software, it actually frees up the documentation team. Instead of having to take all these screenshots manually, they can focus on the more detailed help and the more elaborate functions that are present in our software. And there's actually one more benefit that I haven't mentioned on this slide, which comes very naturally if your documentation or your manual is in some kind of web platform, and that is feedback. If you ship your machine with a manual, chances that you get a remark from your customer, oh, this part in the manual is not really clear, is quite low. So if you add a button which lets them rate certain documentation or detailed help, you could actually get feedback on your manuals. So that way you could also prioritize which items of the software that need to be improved. So this closes the loop of a continuous improvement of your documentation. Also, translations which might not be totally accurate could be reported that way, and that is a really powerful thing. Of course, we've been dreaming now of a lot of features. This isn't all ready, but it's quite nice to see what this leads to. So in conclusion, we have found at least a good starting point to create our alternative for a printed manual, and it quite nicely fits our workflow, be it from code and from development of the UI. Furthermore, it gives us this on-screen help for users. Once they started using it, they expect it to be everywhere, of course, and we'll certainly do our best to provide this at a lot of, in all our software products. And it really assures them that they have the right function, and it's also a way to learn the software easier. For us, internally, it simplifies bookkeeping, no more manual screenshots, and this, as I said, frees up the documentation team to work on the more advanced features of the documentation and more elaborate things there. Furthermore, previously we didn't think that machine-tailored manuals were possible, but by having this fully automated, it's actually quite possible to create a manual that shows only the relevant things for your machine. And as the previous slide showed, there are a lot of ideas to incorporate this into our into our web platform or cloud-based platform, which could provide you with this knowledge. Notice that I didn't have 10 slides indicating how you could work around certain quirks and things. I didn't even mention QML in the last 5 slides. So it shows the real power of QML. Instead of having to work around all the quirks in the software, we could now just use Qt and focus on our business application. And I think that's a really nice thing. So with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention and welcome you to ask any questions you have. Thank you.
Yeah, many thanks. Are there any questions?
Okay, thank you for the great talk. One question I have, how do you generate the IDs? Is there a generator in somewhere or is it random? Or?
It's random, and I've written a small plugin into Qt Creator, so with one shortcut you can enter a random generated ID and already the other syntax as some kind of snippet, which is inserted with one key press. So that really speeds it up indeed, because generating them manually or by head would be quite difficult. Yeah, thank you. Good question.
I was wondering, is the source code for this available? Could we use the same things in our project?
That's a very interesting question. As I said, this is a prototype that I worked on during a train ride. I'm currently in the process of rewriting this, and if possible, I will try to make this public. It's yes, it's certainly a goal to make this available to others to use as well. Thank you.
Any additional question?
Okay. I've played around with tooltips and so on, and sometimes had some problems with scaling UIs. Did you have how did you implement it? Did you use anything of the tooltips or so, or is it just a plain QML overlay?
It's a plain QML overlay, so it's one rectangle on top that covers it with a transparency. So that was quite within the framework, surprisingly enough. So it's quite elegant, and it uses just the basic components of QML.
Okay. If there's questions which come up later on, like I said a couple of times today before, you can raise them later on here on the floor or via our webpage. We will forward them to Koen. And thank you for the nice presentation. And we will have a 30 minutes break with outside coffee and conversation with other people around. And see you back here at 3 o'clock. Thank you.